Imagine a man so terrifying that mothers used his name to silence their children, yet kings begged for his service. He wore armor of shimmering silver, but his hands were stained by the blood of 5,000 innocents in a single night. He turned the agony of Italy into a private counting house, selling betrayal to the highest bidder. But his final act? It wasn't a battle. It was a scam so cold, it left an entire nation worshipping a lie. Under the relentless sun of Provence, the air hangs heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the persistent buzzing of flies. Long wooden tables, usually reserved for the harvest of grapes and olives, are now laden with a different kind of crop that defies the sanctity of the land. Thousands of severed human ears lie in neat, sorted piles, glistening with a dark, sticky residue under the midday heat. This is not a display of frantic madness, but one of cold, calculated inventory where every piece of flesh represents a specific debt owed by a desperate lord to a group of men who have forgotten the meaning of mercy or the concept of peace. The men performing this gruesome task do not shout or celebrate their kill with drunken songs, they work with the quiet intensity of seasoned merchants or meticulous clerks. They record each entry in thick ledgers, their fingers stained with ink and grime as they reconcile the tally of the dead with the promised gold of the contract. In this scorched landscape of the mid-14th century, the value of a man's life has been reduced to a simple mathematical equation. The traditional chivalry of the knightly class has been replaced by a brutal bookkeeping where the only morality is the prompt payment of a debt for services rendered on the field of slaughter. Standing amidst this macabre counting house is a man whose presence demands an immediate and terrifying silence from his subordinates. John Hawkwood does not wear the tattered rags of a common brigand, but a suit of plate armor polished to such a high, mirror-like finish that it reflects the white-hot sun with blinding intensity. To his followers, he appears as a silver ghost, a shimmering figure of order in a world falling into chaotic decay. He is the architect of a new kind of violence, a professional who looks upon a battlefield not as a place for glory, but as a vast, open-air office where the primary objective is the extraction of maximum profit. His eyes, cold and analytical, scan the horizon toward the jagged peaks of the Alps, seeing beyond the mountains to the wealthy, fractured cities of the Italian peninsula. The Great Plague had swept through Europe just over a decade ago, leaving behind a continent of empty villages and broken social hierarchies. In the wake of the Black Death, the survivors have become harder, more cynical, and infinitely more dangerous than their ancestors. Hawkwood understands that the old world is dead, and in its place, a marketplace of steel has emerged where the strongest blades go to the highest bidder regardless of their cause, their noble lineage, or their god. He has spent his youth in the mud of France, fighting for a king who could barely afford to feed his armies, and he has learned the most valuable lesson of the 100 Years' War. Loyalty is a luxury for those who have land and titles, while for a tanner's son from Essex, survival depends on the sharpness of his mind and the discipline of his men. He has gathered around him a cadre of survivors, men who have outlived the pestilence and the famine only to find that their only skill is the systematic application of lethal force. These are the foundations of the White Company, a mercenary brotherhood that operates with the terrifying efficiency of a professional army. The soldiers of the White Company move with a synchronized grace that is entirely alien to the local militias. They are equipped with the longbows of England, weapons capable of piercing the finest plate armor at a distance, and they fight with a cold-blooded pragmatism that ignores the traditional pauses for ransom or parley. Hawkwood has trained them to strike in the dead of night, to use the terrain as a weapon, and to maintain their equipment with religious fervor. Their white surcoats and silvered steel are not merely for show, they are a psychological brand designed to strike fear into any who see them approaching from the horizon. In the camp, there is no room for vanity, every man is a cog in a massive, well-oiled machine of destruction. The hierarchy is absolute, enforced by a commander who views a breach of discipline as a direct threat to his balance sheet. Hawkwood treats his company like a corporation, ensuring that every soldier receives his share of the loot and every injury is compensated according to a prearranged schedule. This promise of regular pay and fair distribution is a radical concept in an age of erratic feudal levies, drawing the most ruthless fighters from across the continent to serve under the banner of the Silver Knight for the simple promise of gold. As the sun begins to set, the atmosphere shifts from one of industry to one of predatory anticipation. The contracts in France are drying up as the kings negotiate fragile truces, leaving thousands of professional killers without a master. Hawkwood knows that a dormant army is a dangerous one, and he looks to the south, where the warring city-states of Italy possess treasures beyond imagination. He picks up a quill, his fingers moving with the precision that guides his sword, drafting letters to the lords of Milan and Florence. He speaks of tactical advantages and the absolute certainty of victory for those who can afford his price. As the first stars appear, the Silver Knight mounts his horse, his armor catching the faint light and glowing with an eerie, phosphorescent quality. He does not look back at the ruin he has orchestrated in Provence, his mind is already calculating the logistics of the mountain passes. The year 1361 will be remembered as the moment the storm broke over the Alps, carrying with it the scent of English iron and the cold logic of a man who turned the art of war into a science of extortion. Italy is waiting, unaware that its most beautiful cities are about to become the counting houses of the damned. In the late autumn of 1361, a chilling wind precedes the arrival of the most efficient killing machine Europe has ever seen. The majestic peaks of the Alps, once considered an impassable barrier for large armies, are breached by a shimmering line of steel that stretches for miles along the treacherous mountain passes. These are the men of the White Company, a mercenary brotherhood forged in the fires of the 100 Years' War, descending upon the lush valleys of Piedmont like a plague of iron locusts. Their armor is polished to such a blinding luster that even under a gray sky, they seem to carry their own malevolent light, signaling the end of an era of delicate Italian diplomacy. The Italian peninsula at this time is a fractured mosaic of proud city-states and wealthy principalities, each more concerned with artistic patronage and subtle courtly intrigue than with the brutal realities of professional warfare. When the scouts of Milan and Turin first witness the approach of the English, they do not see the familiar colorful banners of noble knights, but a disciplined mass of gray and silver. The local lords, accustomed to the theatrical displays of their own condottieri, are entirely unprepared for the arrival of thousands of battle-hardened veterans who view combat not as a tournament for honor, but as a systematic process of liquidation and total conquest. The core of this terrifying force is the English longbowman, a figure that becomes the nightmare of every Italian cavalryman. These men carry massive bows made of yew, taller than a person, capable of launching arrows with such velocity that they can pierce the finest Milanese plate at 200 paces. In the open fields of Lombardy, the traditional charge of the heavy Italian horse is met with a relentless hail of steel-tipped shafts that creates a deafening whistle in the air before slaughtering men and beasts alike. This is not the dance of war the Italians recognize, it is a mechanical delivery of death that ignores the social status of the victim and values only the efficiency of the kill. Unlike the local armies that retreat to their castles at the first sign of rain, John Hawkwood's men are comfortable in the mud and the darkness. They introduce a revolutionary tactic to the peninsula, the dismounted knight. These men, clad in their signature silver-washed plate, fight shoulder to shoulder in a dense wall of iron, their long lances projecting outward like the quills of a deadly porcupine. By choosing to fight on foot, they eliminate the vulnerability of their horses and create an immovable anchor on the battlefield. This tactical shift renders the graceful maneuvers of the Italian nobility obsolete, forcing them to confront a wall of cold steel that refuses to break or bargain. Cruelty is not merely a byproduct of their presence, it is a meticulously applied tool of psychological warfare used to accelerate the payment of ransoms. When a village refuses to open its granaries or a small town hesitates to pay the demanded protection money, the White Company does not lay a traditional siege. Instead, they vanish into the night only to reappear at dawn, having already scaled the walls using specialized portable ladders. The subsequent violence is swift, silent, and absolute. They do not merely take what they need, they destroy what they cannot carry, leaving behind a trail of smoking ruins and terrified survivors who spread the word that the English are not men, but devils. The Marquis of Montferrat is the first to realize that these foreigners are the ultimate weapon for his ambitions, hiring them for a sum that would have bankrupted a smaller state. With the English at his back, he tears through the lands of his rivals, but he soon discovers that he does not lead the White Company, he merely points them in a direction. John Hawkwood maintains a terrifying autonomy, ensuring his men remain loyal only to the gold and the ledger. The Marquis watches in helpless silence as his own allies are looted by his supposed protectors, realizing too late that he has invited a wolf into the sheepfold who will eventually demand the shepherd's own throat as payment. By 1364, the focus of the company shifts toward the immense wealth of Tuscany and the defiant walls of Florence and Pisa. The landscape changes from the rolling hills of the north to the sun-drenched olive groves of the south, but the results of the English presence remain the same. Entire valleys are methodically stripped of their resources, with Hawkwood's quartermasters keeping detailed records of every cow seized and every bushel of grain burned. They turn the fertile earth into a blackened wasteland, ensuring that any city attempting to resist will face not just the sword, but a slow and agonizing starvation that no amount of gold can easily remedy. The local population begins to view the very sight of silver on the horizon as a harbinger of the apocalypse. Mothers in the villages of the Apennines no longer tell stories of ancient ghosts, but speak the name of Giovanni Acuto, the Italian corruption of Hawkwood, to silence their weeping children. There is a specific, haunting quality to the silence that follows a White Company raid. The birds stop singing and the wind seems to carry the metallic tang of dried blood. The English move with a purposeful, rhythmic stride, their boots beating a funeral drum against the cobblestones of every town they pass through, leaving a legacy of fear that will persist for centuries. In the high halls of the Vatican, the Pope's legates receive frantic reports of the devastation, their gilded quills trembling as they record the mounting casualties. They are used to negotiating with kings who fear God, but they find that Hawkwood and his captains have no such superstitions. For the English, the church is merely another bank to be plundered or another client to be squeezed. The spiritual authority of Rome means nothing to a man who has seen the Black Death claim both the priest and the sinner with equal indifference. The papacy finds itself in the humiliating position of having to offer vast sums of gold just to keep the silver-clad army away from the gates of Avignon. Hawkwood himself remains a cipher to the Italians, a man of few words who spends his evenings studying maps and account books rather than indulging in the carnal excesses of his men. He sits in his tent, the walls draped in captured silk, while the air outside is filled with the screams of those who could not pay his price. He possesses a strange, administrative calm that is more unsettling than the rage of a common tyrant. To him, the destruction of a 1,000-year-old vineyard is no more emotional than the crossing out of a line in a merchant's register. He is the first modern general, one who understands that logistics and terror are the twin pillars of a successful campaign. The city of Pisa, desperate to crush its Florentine rivals, offers the White Company a contract that sets a new standard for mercenary greed. They are promised not only gold but also the right to pillage at will, provided they focus their destructive energy on the territories of the Lily. Hawkwood accepts with a formal nod, and soon the outskirts of Florence are illuminated by the fires of its own villas. The wealthy merchants look out from their high towers, watching their life's work turn to ash beneath the boots of men who don't even speak their language. The English presence has turned the refined competition between city-states into a primal struggle for basic survival. As the months pass, the tactics of the White Company evolve to include the use of early gunpowder weapons, adding the thunder of primitive cannons to the whistle of arrows. The sound of these explosions, echoing through the narrow Tuscan valleys, creates a sensory overload that shatters the morale of any local defense force. The smoke from these weapons mingles with the haze of burning villages, creating a permanent shroud over the region. Hawkwood watches the carnage with a detached interest, noting how the new technology shortens the time required to extract a surrender. For him, every innovation is measured only by how quickly it converts a landscape into a profit. The concept of a front line disappears in Italy, replaced by a constant state of predatory movement where no one is safe, even miles behind the supposed theater of war. The English soldiers, often traveling light and living off the land, can cover incredible distances in a single night, appearing behind city walls that were thought to be secure. This ubiquity of threat breaks the spirit of the peasantry, who stop planting crops and start fleeing into the mountains, leaving the land to be reclaimed by thorns and wolves. The very fabric of Italian agricultural society begins to unravel under the pressure of a war that never seems to rest or find a conclusion. Even the most powerful despots of Italy, men like the Visconti of Milan, find themselves forced to play a humiliating game of cat and mouse with the English captain. They attempt to bribe his lieutenants, only to find that the discipline within the White Company is maintained through a combination of shared profit and swift, lethal punishment. Hawkwood has created a society within a society, a mobile state where the only law is the contract and the only citizen is the soldier. This independence makes him more dangerous than any rival prince, as he cannot be deposed by a palace coup or quieted by a marriage alliance. He must be paid or he must be fought. By the end of this period, the name of the White Company has become synonymous with an era of professional cruelty that redefines the Italian 14th century. The rulers of the peninsula, once so proud of their cunning, now sit in dark rooms with their treasurers, desperately calculating how much longer they can afford to keep the Silver Knight at a distance. They sign their names to parchment with fingers that will not stop shaking, knowing that each signature is a stay of execution rather than a peace treaty. The beast has been invited in, and it has found the climate of Italy very much to its liking, thriving in the blood of a land that once thought it knew the meaning of power. In the bleak winter of 1377, the city of Cesena stood as a silent witness to the most horrific chapter in the career of John Hawkwood. The air was sharp with the bite of frost, and the stone walls of the houses seemed to sweat with the cold, damp dread that had settled over the population. This was a city that had dared to ripple with the spirit of rebellion against the authority of the Church, and the response from the papal legates was not to be a matter of theological debate, but one of absolute and final extermination. The citizens huddled in their homes, unaware that their doom had already been signed in a tent outside the walls. The architect of this impending storm was Robert of Geneva, a man of the cloth who possessed the heart of a butcher and the ambition of a conqueror. He summoned Hawkwood to his presence, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of a dozen black candles. The command given was devoid of any spiritual grace. The city was to be pacified by the complete removal of its inhabitants. Robert of Geneva wanted a desert that he could call peace, and he looked to the English mercenary to provide the steel necessary for such a transformation. For the cardinal, the lives of 5,000 people were merely obstacles to be cleared from the path of papal supremacy. John Hawkwood listened to the order with the same stoic indifference he applied to a supply manifest or a payroll ledger. He did not ask for justification, nor did he offer a prayer for the souls he was about to harvest. To him, the cardinal's gold was the only moral compass that mattered in the shifting landscape of the Italian wars. He stepped out of the command tent, his silver armor catching the pale moonlight, and signaled to his captains. The White Company, a machine of war that had been refined over decades of slaughter, began to move toward the gates of Cesena with a disciplined, rhythmic clatter of boots and scabbards. The massacre began not with a roar, but with a series of coordinated strikes that caught the city in its sleep. The English soldiers moved through the narrow alleyways with a terrifying precision, their longbows and poleaxes making short work of anyone who appeared in the doorways. There was no distinction made between the armed guard and the nursing mother, nor between the elderly priest and the frightened child. The contract demanded total pacification, and in the lexicon of the White Company, that meant the silence of the grave. The screams of the dying were muffled by the thick winter fog, creating a surreal and private hell for every household. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, it revealed a city that had been transformed into a charnel house. The central canals, which usually reflected the blue of the Italian sky, were now thick with a viscous, bubbling fluid that flowed in a sluggish, dark crimson stream. Bodies were piled in the squares like discarded lumber, their blood soaking into the ancient cobblestones until the earth itself seemed to be weeping. 5,000 lives had been extinguished in a matter of hours, and the air was heavy with the copper tang of fresh slaughter and the acrid smoke of small fires that had broken out in the confusion of the night. Hawkwood rode through the streets on his massive warhorse, his gaze never wavering as he passed the heaps of the dead. He stopped by one of the canals and watched the blood swirl into the water, his expression as unreadable as a stone mask. It was in this moment of absolute carnage that the English captain reached a profound realization about the nature of his profession in Italy. He saw that the high ideals of the church and the noble rhetoric of the princes were merely masks for the same predatory greed that drove his own men. If a representative of God could order such a butcher's work, then loyalty was a phantom and honor was a lie. This epiphany marked the beginning of Hawkwood's transition from a mere soldier of fortune to a master of the geopolitical chessboards of the peninsula. He understood that in a world where everything was for sale, the most valuable commodity was not the victory itself, but the threat of destruction. He began to treat his contracts not as sacred bonds, but as fluid negotiations that could be altered whenever a better offer appeared on the horizon. The blood of Cesena had washed away any lingering traces of feudal fealty, leaving behind a men who would serve only the highest bidder and the most advantageous circumstance. Shortly after the horror of Cesena, Hawkwood broke his ties with the papal forces, sensing that the tide of gold was shifting toward the wealthy merchant republics. He offered his services to the city of Florence, the very state he had spent years terrorizing and extorting. The Florentines, desperate for protection and terrified of the monster they had once cursed, welcomed him with open arms and heavy purses. They saw in Hawkwood a necessary evil, a shield that could be used against their rivals in Pisa and Milan. The mercenary accepted their florins with a cold smile, knowing that he had just sold his sword to his former enemies. His tenure in Florence was marked by a series of masterful betrayals that kept the city-state in a permanent condition of anxious dependency. He would lead the Florentine armies to the gates of a rival city, only to halt the assault at the last moment when a secret messenger from the enemy arrived with a more lucrative counteroffer. This was the art of the double cross, a game where Hawkwood would sell his absence from the battlefield for twice the price of his presence. He turned the act of switching sides into a strategic maneuver that maximized his profit while minimizing the risk to his own irreplaceable veterans. In one notable instance, while supposedly in the pay of Pisa, Hawkwood engaged in a series of clandestine communications with the leaders of Florence. He managed to extract payments from both sides simultaneously, promising the Pisans an overwhelming victory while assuring the Florentines that his men would not strike the killing blow. He manipulated the flow of information so effectively that the two cities found themselves funding the same army to fight a war that Hawkwood had no intention of finishing. This was not the conduct of a knight, but the operation of a high-stakes extortionist who had mastered the psychology of fear. The Italian rulers soon found themselves trapped in a web of Hawkwood's making, where they were forced to pay him not only to fight for them, but also to prevent him from fighting against them. This form of military blackmail became his primary source of income, as he moved his company from one territory to another like a roaming tax collector. He would camp his men on the borders of a wealthy duchy and simply wait. Within days, the local lords would send a delegation with chests of gold, begging him to take his silver-clad killers elsewhere. He had discovered that the mere shadow of the White Company was worth as much as their blades. The complexity of his schemes required a mind that could track multiple layers of deceit across several different languages and political systems. He maintained a network of spies and cougoir-like agents in every major court, ensuring that he always knew the exact state of his employer's treasury. If he sensed that a city was running low on funds, he would immediately open negotiations with their wealthiest rival, often using his current employer's confidential military plans as a bargaining chip. He was a master of the preemptive strike, not on the field of battle, but in the halls of power where contracts were drafted and broken. Through these years of shifting allegiances, Hawkwood's personal wealth grew to astronomical proportions, rivaling that of the princes he served. He invested his blood-soaked gains into lands and fortresses, creating a shadow empire that spanned across the very territories he had once pillaged. He was no longer a common adventurer looking for a meal, he was a sovereign entity in his own right, an independent power that could tip the balance of any conflict in the peninsula. His name was spoken with a mixture of revulsion and awe, for he had proven that in Italy, a man with enough steel and enough cynicism could rewrite the laws of the world. The massacre at Cesena remained a dark foundation upon which his new life was built, a reminder of the absolute ruthlessness that was required to survive in the 14th century. Whenever a young knight or a naive diplomat spoke to him of honor, Hawkwood would look at his hands and see the phantom stains of that winter night. He knew that the only thing standing between a man and the canal was the weight of his purse and the sharpness of his mind. He continued to play his grand game, weaving a tapestry of betrayal that covered the map of Italy in a shroud of silver and blood, always staying one step ahead of the vengeance he so richly deserved. By the time he reached the height of his influence, the English condottiero had become the ultimate symbol of the mercenary age. He had served the Pope, the Visconti, the Republic of Florence, and the Lords of Pisa, often in rapid and dizzying succession. Each transition was marked by a careful calculation of profit and loss, with no room for sentiment or regret. He had turned the chaos of the Italian wars into a private counting house, where every broken treaty was a windfall and every dead city was a line of credit. The predator had become the master, and the land of Italy had become his bloody feeder, sustaining his army of iron locusts for decades. As the decades of the late 14th century unfolded, the image of John Hawkwood began to undergo a profound and unsettling metamorphosis in the collective mind of Italy. The man who had once been the personification of a foreign scourge was now viewed through the softening lens of political necessity and weary admiration. His hair had turned the color of the very steel he had used to subjugate the land, and his movements had acquired a deliberate, stately grace that masked the predatory instincts beneath. The terror he had once inspired had not vanished, but it had calcified into a form of respect that only the truly powerful can command from those they have broken. In the year 1375, the Republic of Florence, once the most vocal victim of his extortion, made a decision that shocked the courts of Europe but perfectly illustrated the cynical pragmatism of the age. They realized that it was far cheaper and safer to own the wolf than to constantly pay him to hunt elsewhere. The city fathers invited the English captain into the heart of their magnificent commune, offering him the title of Captain General of their armed forces. With a stroke of a quill on expensive vellum, the man who had burned their vineyards was transformed into the supreme guardian of their liberty and their gold. This transition was accompanied by a financial arrangement of such staggering generosity that it became the talk of every merchant house from London to Constantinople. The Florentines granted Hawkwood a massive lifelong pension, ensuring that his loyalty was anchored by the heaviest weights of gold. They provided him with tax exemptions and a series of luxurious estates that dotted the very hillsides where his archers had once stood to rain death upon the valley. It was a masterpiece of civic seduction, a process by which a barbarian was domesticated by the sheer overwhelming force of Italian wealth and refined social standing. Soon, the rugged soldier from Essex was no longer found only in the mud of a military camp, but in the polished marble halls of the Palazzo Vecchio. He sat at long, candlelit tables surrounded by the finest minds of the early Renaissance, men who were beginning to rediscover the wisdom of the ancients. Philosophers and poets, who spent their days debating the nature of the soul and the structure of the perfect republic, now listened with rapt attention as Hawkwood spoke of the cold mechanics of power. He provided them with the raw, brutal data of human nature that their classical texts could only hint at, becoming a living textbook of political reality. To these intellectuals, Hawkwood was not a monster, but a fascinating specimen of the noumen, the individual who creates his own destiny through strength and cunning. They watched as he navigated the complex social hierarchies of Florence with the same ease he had used to navigate the mountain passes of the Apennines. He learned to appreciate the subtle flavors of Tuscan wines and the intricate beauty of the frescoes that were beginning to adorn the city's churches. The butcher had discovered the pleasures of the connoisseur, proving that the taste for blood and the taste for beauty are not as mutually exclusive as the moralists would like to believe. The crowning achievement of his social ascent was his marriage to Donnina Visconti, the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Milan. This union linked the English mercenary to one of the most powerful and ruthless dynasties in Italy, effectively making him a member of the peninsula's high nobility. The wedding was a spectacle of immense pomp, a symbolic merging of old blood and new iron. Hawkwood stood beside his bride not as an employee, but as an equal to the princes who had once tried to bribe him. He had successfully climbed the social ladder using the severed limbs of his enemies as rungs, reaching a height few could have imagined. As the years of his residency in Florence stretched on, Hawkwood's past began to be rewritten by the city's official chroniclers. The massacres and the betrayals were subtly rebranded as tactical necessities or the unfortunate consequences of a chaotic age. He was portrayed as a man of steadfast character who had brought stability to a region plagued by petty disputes. The people of Florence, who had once hid in their cellars at the mention of his name, now cheered when they saw his silver armor glinting in the sun during civic processions. Memory, it seemed, was as easy to buy and sell as a mercenary's contract. He transformed the very concept of betrayal into a sophisticated form of diplomacy that the Italians called virtù. When he abandoned a former ally or negotiated a secret truce, it was no longer seen as a lack of honor, but as a brilliant display of foresight and statecraft. He taught the ruling elite that the only true sin was failure, and the only true virtue was the preservation of one's own interests. This dark philosophy permeated the political culture of the city, influencing a generation of thinkers who would eventually give rise to the cold, analytical realism of the next century's most famous political theorists. Despite his new status, Hawkwood never fully discarded the habits of the professional soldier. His household was run with the same rigorous discipline as the White Company, and he continued to keep a watchful eye on the geopolitical shifts of the Mediterranean. He was a man who understood that peace was merely a different form of conflict, one fought with words and money rather than bows and lances. His presence in Florence acted as a deterrent to any who might think the Republic was soft, for everyone knew that beneath the fine silk robes of the statesman remained the iron heart of a man who knew exactly how to kill. He became a living symbol of a world where traditional morality had been rendered obsolete by the sheer force of individual will. Visitors to the city would seek him out, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary commander whose name still echoed with a faint, shivering dread in the distant corners of Europe. They found a man of quiet dignity, whose every word was measured and whose gaze remained as piercing as it had been on the day he crossed the Alps. He was the personification of the 14th century, a bridge between the crumbling ruins of feudalism and the dawn of a new, more calculating era of human history. There was a profound irony in his daily life as he walked through the markets and squares of a city he had once intended to destroy. He would often stop to admire the construction of the great cathedral, watching the masons and architects as they worked to create a monument to the glory of God. It was a bizarre juxtaposition. The man who had spilled more blood than any other in Italy was now one of the primary financiers of its greatest spiritual and artistic achievements. His gold, much of it extracted through terror, was being transformed into the marble and stained glass that would define the beauty of the Renaissance for all time. Even in his twilight years, the shadow of his former life would occasionally flicker in his eyes during a particularly tense council meeting or a diplomatic dinner. When he spoke of the fall of a city or the routing of an army, his voice carried a weight of authority that silenced every other person in the room. He did not need to raise his voice or reach for a weapon. The mere memory of what he had done in Cesena or Faenza was enough to ensure that his will was respected. He had achieved the ultimate power, the ability to rule through a reputation that was built on a foundation of absolute and uncompromising ruthlessness. The elite of Florence vied for his company, believing that some of his legendary luck and tactical genius might rub off on them. He was invited to the villas of the wealthy, where he would sit in lush gardens and listen to the music of the lute, a far cry from the discordant sounds of a besieged city. He observed the vanity of the nobles with a detached, secret amusement, knowing that if the flow of gold ever stopped, these same men would be the first to flee or to sell one another out. He remained an outsider in their world, a predator who had learned to mimic the manners of the prey. He became a mentor to the younger generation of Florentine leaders, teaching them that the state is not a moral entity but a machine that requires constant maintenance and protection. He emphasized the importance of a professional military and the dangers of relying on the fickle whims of a citizen militia. His lessons were absorbed into the very fabric of Florentine administration, shaping the republic into a more resilient and formidable power. He was the architect of their security, a role that he fulfilled with a cold-blooded efficiency that left no room for the romantic illusions of the past. By the time the year 1390 arrived, John Hawkwood was no longer a man, but an institution. He was the physical manifestation of the fact that in the game of life, the rules are written by those who have the strength to survive and the intelligence to manipulate. He had successfully navigated the most dangerous waters in the world, turning every betrayal into a victory and every enemy into a servant. He sat in his study, surrounded by maps of a land he had helped to shape through fire and sword, a man who had proven that conscience is a burden that the truly great simply cannot afford to carry. His story became a dark fairy tale for the age, a narrative of how a common archer could rise to be the master of an entire peninsula. It was a story that both inspired and terrified, for it revealed the terrifying truth that the structures of civilization are fragile and easily subverted by those who do not fear them. Hawkwood remained the silver ghost of Florence, a figure of awe who moved through the city like a quiet storm, reminding everyone that the world belongs to the bold, the heartless, and the prepared. He had won the final battle, the battle for his own place in the history of a land that should have hated him. As the sun set over the Arno, the light would catch the old commander's profile, making him look like a statue of ancient bronze. He reflected on the nature of the men he had killed, wondering if their souls were as cheap as the gold he had received for their deaths. Such thoughts were brief, however, for Hawkwood was a man of the present, always focused on the next move in the endless game of survival. He watched the city lights flicker on, one by one, knowing that his presence was the only thing standing between the delicate beauty and the darkness that waited just beyond the horizon, a darkness he knew better than anyone. The paradox of his existence was perhaps most evident in his relationship with the artists of the city. He commissioned works that depicted him not as a marauder, but as a paragon of civic duty and military excellence. He understood the power of the image long before the world had a name for it, using the burgeoning talents of the Florentine painters to cement his legacy. He wanted to be remembered not for the blood he had shed, but for the order he had maintained. It was a grand act of self-mythologizing, a final campaign to conquer the future and ensure that his name would be spoken with reverence for centuries to come. In the grand tapestries of his life, there were no threads of regret, only the strong, unbreakable lines of tactical success and material gain. He had lived through the most turbulent century in human history and emerged as its undisputed champion. He looked at the world and saw a series of contracts to be fulfilled and balances to be settled. To John Hawkwood, the world was a ledger, and he was determined to ensure that when his final page was turned, the bottom line would be written in the deepest, most indelible gold, a testament to a life lived without the suffocating constraints of a common conscience. The legacy he left behind was a bitter pill for the idealistic to swallow, for it proved that the most brutal of beginnings could lead to the most respectable of endings. He had turned the art of war into a business and the art of betrayal into a statecraft, leaving a blueprint for every tyrant and opportunist who would follow in his footsteps. Florence, the city of flowers, had become the sanctuary of a man who had sown only thorns, and in doing so, it had validated his entire existence. He remained the ultimate enigma, a man who had found grace in the eyes of a world that he had once set out to burn to the very ground. In the twilight of his existence, John Hawkwood resided within the suffocating grandeur of his Florentine palace, where the walls were draped in heavy Flemish tapestries that muffled the sounds of a city he had once held at his mercy. The air in these high-vaulted rooms was thick with the scent of expensive beeswax and imported spices, a far cry from the acrid smoke and iron tang of his youth. He moved through the corridors with a slow, deliberate cadence, his footsteps echoing against the cold marble floors that reflected the flickering light of 1,000 silver candelabras. He was a prisoner of his own success, surrounded by a luxury that felt as heavy and restrictive as the plate armor he had worn for half a century. His body, once a finely tuned instrument of destruction, had become a map of old scars and stiffening joints that protested every movement in the damp morning air. The hands that had once directed the slaughter of thousands now trembled slightly as they reached for a silver chalice or a piece of parchment. He would spend hours staring out of high windows at the Tuscan hills, his mind drifting back to the muddy fields of his homeland. Despite the titles and the wealth, he felt the pull of the English earth, a primitive desire to close the circle of his life where it had begun, far from the intricate deceits and the sun-drenched violence of the Italian peninsula. The decision to return to England became an obsession that occupied his final months, leading him to begin the meticulous liquidation of his vast Italian holdings. He sold his castles, his vineyards, and his estates with the same cold efficiency he had used to negotiate the ransom of a captured prince. He watched as his immense wealth was converted back into liquid assets, planning a departure that would be as grand and calculated as his arrival had been 30 years prior. He envisioned the green, mist-shrouded fields of Essex and the quiet church of his childhood, seeking a sanctuary where the ghosts of the Mediterranean could not follow him into the shadows. However, the city of Florence viewed his impending departure with a mixture of profound gratitude and sudden, piercing anxiety. To the merchant elite, Hawkwood was not merely a man, he was an essential component of their civic security, a living talisman whose presence alone deterred the predatory ambitions of their neighbors. The councils of the Republic met in secret, debating how to honor a man who had transformed from their most feared predator into their most cherished protector. They saw in his aging frame the fragile foundation of their own prosperity, and they prepared to bid him a farewell that would be remembered for centuries as a testament to their own power. In the middle of March in the year 1394, the cold grip of winter finally proved too much for the old commander's weary heart. He fell ill in his palace, the fever stripping away the last of his legendary strength and leaving him a frail shadow in the center of a vast, silken bed. Outside, the city held its breath as the news of his decline spread through the markets and the workshops. The bells of the campanile remained silent, as if the very stones of Florence were waiting for the final departure of the Silver Knight. On the 17th day of that month, the men who had survived 100 battles finally surrendered to the only enemy he could not bribe. The announcement of his death triggered a wave of public mourning that was as spectacular as it was hypocritical. The government of Florence ordered a state funeral of unprecedented proportions, decreeing that the city should treat the English mercenary with the same reverence usually reserved for the most holy saints or the most gifted poets. Black banners were draped from the high towers, and the shops were shuttered as the entire population prepared to witness the passing of an era. It was as if by burying him with such pomp, the citizens hoped to bury their own memories of the terror he had inflicted upon them in the darker days of the past, seeking a clean slate through ritual. The preparation of the body was a ritual of absolute opulence, designed to transform the mortal remains of a butcher into the icons of a hero. His corpse was bathed in scented oils and draped in heavy robes of cloth of gold that shimmered with an internal light. On his chest, they placed a baton of command, and his head was rested upon a cushion of crimson velvet embroidered with the lilies of Florence. In death, he was no longer a man of Essex but a prince of the Republic, a creature of gold and silk who bore no resemblance to the blood-stained soldier who had once waded through the canals of Cesena while the innocent screamed for mercy under a pale winter moon. The funeral procession was a massive, slow-moving river of humanity that wound through the narrow streets of the city toward the great cathedral. Thousands of citizens lined the route, their faces twisted in a performative grief that masked a deeper, more complex range of emotions. There were men in the crowd who had seen their brothers killed by Hawkwood's archers, and women whose families had been ruined by his extortions, yet they all bowed their heads in silent respect as the gilded bier passed them by. The collective amnesia of the crowd was a powerful force, fueled by the desire to belong to a narrative of shared triumph and divine protection in a dangerous world. At the head of the procession walked the high officials of the city, their dark robes contrasting sharply with the bright, defiant colors of the White Company's veterans who marched in silent formation behind their fallen leader. These soldiers, men who had followed Hawkwood through the fire and the mud, carried his armor and his banners with a grim solemnity that was the only genuine emotion in the entire spectacle. They knew the men behind the myth, the cold-blooded strategist who had always ensured they were paid in full, and they mourned him as the architect of their own survival in a world that had tried to consume them all without mercy or hesitation. The great cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore was filled with the heavy smoke of incense and the haunting sounds of a choir that seemed to reach for the very heavens. As the bier was placed in the center of the nave, the light from the stained glass windows cast long, multicolored shadows across the golden robes of the dead commander. The archbishop delivered a lengthy oration, praising Hawkwood as the savior of the Republic and a paragon of military virtue. He spoke of the commander's wisdom and his commitment to the defense of Florentine liberty, conveniently omitting any mention of the contracts he had broken or the cities he had burned to the ground for profit. To the observer, the scene was a masterpiece of political theater, a moment where the lines between reality and legend were permanently blurred. The city was not just burying a man, it was consecrating a myth that would serve its interests for generations to come. They needed a hero to justify their own survival and their own methods of power, and Hawkwood was the perfect candidate for such a transformation. In the hallowed silence of the cathedral, the screams of the past were replaced by the harmonious chants of the present, creating a sanctified memory that was as beautiful as it was false, a golden mask placed over a face of iron to deceive the future. Even as the burial was completed, the authorities were already planning the next phase of his immortalization. They commissioned a monumental fresco to be painted on the wall of the cathedral, a work that would ensure his image would remain in the minds of the people long after his bones had turned to dust. They wanted an image of power and grace, a commander on a massive warhorse who looked down upon the congregation with a gaze of eternal vigilance. This artwork was intended to be more than a simple memorial, it was to be a permanent reminder of the strength of Florence and the quality of the men she chose to lead her armies into battle regardless of their origin. The artists were instructed to depict him not as he was in his final, withered days, but in the prime of his military glory. He was to be shown in full plate armor, holding his commander's baton with a firm, confident grip that suggested he was still directing the flow of history from beyond the grave. The horse was to be a powerful beast, its muscles tensed as if ready to leap forward into the fray at a single word from its master. Every detail was carefully curated to project an image of noble authority and disciplined strength, creating a visual lie that would be accepted as truth by the millions who would stand beneath it in the coming centuries of the city's history. The irony of this project was not lost on the few who still remembered the real John Hawkwood. They knew that the man on the wall bore little resemblance to the calculating mercenary who had spent his life balancing ledgers of blood and gold. Yet, they also understood that the image was exactly what the city needed to believe in itself. The fresco became a mirror in which the Florentines saw their own ambitions and their own justifications reflected back at them, a grand aesthetic achievement that celebrated the triumph of will over morality and the power of art to rewrite the darkest chapters of human existence, turning a predator into a patron of the civic spirit. As the work on the fresco progressed, the final wish of the commander began to take shape in a different way. The King of England, Richard II, sent a formal request to the Republic, asking that the remains of his famous subject be returned to his native soil for burial. The Florentines, ever mindful of the diplomatic advantages of such a gesture, agreed to surrender the body they had just so lavishly honored. They prepared to send the golden-clad corpse on one last journey across the continent, a final march that would take him from the warm marble of Tuscany to the cold, grey earth of the English countryside he had so long desired to see again before his light failed. The departure of the remains was a quiet affair compared to the funeral, a small convoy of knights and priests moving toward the mountain passes under the cover of a soft morning mist. The city was left with the fresco and the memories, the physical presence of the men replaced by the enduring power of his legend. Florence had extracted everything it could from Hawkwood during his life, and now, in his death, it had used his name to build a monument to its own prestige. The Silver Knight was gone, leaving behind a trail of gold that led all the way to the heart of the church and the center of the Renaissance world, leaving a void filled only by his painted ghost. In the quiet villages of Essex, where the name of Hawkwood was spoken with a mixture of pride and confusion, the return of the local boy made good was seen as a divine event. They did not know the details of the massacres in Italy or the intricate betrayals of the city-states, they only knew that one of their own had risen to the heights of worldly power and had come home to rest. The church in Sybil Hedingham prepared a simple tomb, a modest resting place that stood in stark contrast to the magnificent cathedral in Florence. Here, the man of iron would finally be reclaimed by the rain and the silence of the land that had birthed him before the world knew his name. Back in Italy, the legacy of the White Company persisted in the tactical manuals and the diplomatic strategies of the rising princes. Hawkwood had changed the nature of war on the peninsula forever, leaving behind a professional class of killers who would continue to treat the land as a marketplace for their lethal services. The order he had maintained through terror was a fragile thing, and the vacuum left by his death was quickly filled by lesser men who lacked his vision but shared his lack of conscience. The era of the great condottieri was only just beginning, and they all looked to the image on the cathedral wall as their ultimate inspiration for the bloody years to come. As the final pigments were applied to the fresco, the image of John Hawkwood settled into its permanent place in the visual vocabulary of the city. He remained there, a silver ghost trapped in a sea of paint, watching over the worshippers and the tourists with a cold, unblinking eye. He had achieved the ultimate mercenary victory. He had sold his life to the highest bidder and then sold his memory to the future. The man who had burned the world now stood as its eternal guardian, a testament to the fact that in the long, bloody history of mankind, it is not the most righteous who are remembered, but those who are the most effective at surviving the fires they light. The chapter of the English mercenary in Italy closed not with a scream, but with the quiet scratch of a painter's brush and the solemn tolling of a distant bell. The land he had ravaged was now his greatest admirer, and the people he had oppressed were his most loyal mourners. In this supreme act of historical alchemy, the blood of the innocent had been turned into the gold of a legend, and the name of John Hawkwood was inscribed in the rolls of honor, forever separated from the dark reality of his deeds by the blinding light of his own spectacular success. He left the world as he had lived in it, surrounded by an opulence that was bought with the lives of others. The funeral train moved with a ghostly slow pace through the jagged, snow-dusted passes of the northern mountains, a somber procession of iron and wood carrying the remains of the men who had redefined the fate of Italy. The wind howled through the crevices of the stone peaks, sounding like the distant, hollow echoes of the thousands of men who had perished under the cold direction of John Hawkwood. In the center of the convoy, the leaden casket was draped in heavy, dark velvet, protecting the bones that King Richard II had so urgently requested for a final resting place in the damp earth of England. It was a journey of silent, grim reverence, a final tribute to a soldier whose reach had spanned the continent. While the bones traveled toward the English coast, a different kind of movement was taking place within the high, sun-drenched halls of the Florentine treasury. The city officials, men who had spent their lives calculating the exact value of every florin and every debt, entered the late commander's residence with the heavy expectation of settling a vast and complex estate. They moved through the grand rooms with the quiet confidence of heirs, believing that the immense wealth Hawkwood had accumulated during his decades of service would now serve to bolster the Republic's coffers. They expected to find chests overflowing with gold and deeds to vast, fertile lands that would secure the city's future. The initial silence of the palace felt heavy and significant, but as the scribes began to open the iron-bound chests left behind in the private study, the air in the room suddenly turned cold with a different kind of dread. Instead of the dull glint of gold or the weight of precious gems, they found only neat, terrifyingly organized stacks of parchment. Every drawer was filled with records of transactions that had been completed months before the commander's heart had finally failed. The men of the treasury stood in stunned silence as they realized they were not looking at a fortune, but at the systematic evidence of a grand and final withdrawal of every available asset. With trembling hands, the lead accountant began to decipher the complex web of financial maneuvers that Hawkwood had orchestrated during the very months the city was preparing his lavish funeral. The records revealed that the Silver Knight had been quietly selling off his Italian properties, from the lush vineyards in the hills to the fortified castles that guarded the trade routes. These lands, which the Florentines had granted him as symbols of eternal gratitude, had been converted into liquid capital and funneled through foreign merchant banks, moving north toward the safety of the English crown long before his body was even cold in the cathedral. The realization hit the council like a physical blow. Their hero had not intended to leave anything to the city that had worshipped him. He had treated the Republic of Florence not as a home or a cause, but as a final, high-yield investment that he had liquidated at the perfect moment. Every dinner he had shared with their philosophers and every parade he had led through their streets had been a calculated performance designed to mask the quiet extraction of his wealth. He had used their trust as a shield, ensuring that no one would look too closely at his ledgers until he was beyond the reach of their laws and their vengeance. The scale of the financial betrayal became even more apparent when the officials calculated the outstanding debts left in the wake of his departure. The city had spent astronomical sums on his lifelong pension, his tax exemptions, and the staggering costs of his state funeral, believing that his presence was a permanent asset. Now, they were left with empty coffers and a mounting fiscal crisis that would take years to resolve. The citizens, who had cheered for the Silver Knight as a symbol of their own greatness, were now the ones who would have to pay for his ghost through increased taxes and a devalued currency. In the private quarters of the palace, his widow, Donina, was left to face the consequences of a man who had prioritized his own legacy over the security of his own house. Even his family, connected to the powerful Visconti, discovered that the majority of the fortune they expected to inherit had been placed in trusts and accounts far beyond their legal grasp. Hawkwood had operated with the singular focus of a man who belonged to no one but himself, ensuring that his exit from the stage of history was as clean and as profitable as any military campaign he had ever conducted in the mud of the plains. The anger within the city's ruling council boiled over into a silent, simmering resentment as they looked at the contracts they had signed with such pride. They saw now that they had been outmaneuvered not on a field of battle, but in the quiet arena of the ledger and the law. The men they had called their savior had spent his final days ensuring that his death would be a financial catastrophe for them, a parting gift of absolute cynicism from a master of the double cross. He had not just served them for gold, he had tricked them into paying for the very rope that was now tightening around their economic throat. As the news of the empty treasury began to leak into the streets, the mood of the populace shifted from mournful reverence to a bitter, confused outrage. The merchants who had provided the silk for his funeral and the masons who had worked on his monuments realized that the gold they had been promised was a vanishing phantom. The air in the squares, once filled with the harmonious sounds of the Renaissance, was now thick with the murmurs of men who realized they had been the fools in a grand play directed by a foreign butcher. The Silver Knight was gone, and he had taken the very lifeblood of the city with him. The ultimate indignity, however, was still waiting to be revealed within the sacred walls of the Santa Maria del Fiore, the great heart of the city's spiritual life. The citizens continued to gather beneath the magnificent monument that had been commissioned to honor Hawkwood, looking up at the towering image of the commander on his warhorse. They prayed for his soul and for the protection of the city, believing that the massive structure of bronze or stone was a permanent testament to their shared history. It was a focal point of civic pride, a visual anchor that stood as a symbol of the Republic's enduring power and its ability to reward its champions. However, as the dust of the funeral settled and the architects began to examine the monument more closely for maintenance, a terrifying truth began to emerge from the shadows of the nave. The massive, impressive structure that appeared to be a solid, expensive statue was, in reality, a masterfully executed illusion. It was not a work of heavy, enduring sculpture that had cost the city a fortune in materials, but a clever fresco painted onto the flat surface of the wall. The artist had used a technique designed to mimic the three-dimensional depth and the color of aged bronze, creating a visual lie that had deceived the eyes of every person in Florence. The realization that their great monument was merely paint and plaster struck the city with the force of a final, mocking laugh from the grave. They had wanted to immortalize a hero in the most expensive and permanent way possible, but they had ended up with a cheap, two-dimensional imitation that could be wiped away with a damp cloth. It was the perfect metaphor for Hawkwood's entire career, a magnificent, shimmering exterior that hid a hollow and predatory core. The city had paid for a legend, but they had received only the image of one, a flat ghost that occupied space without having any true weight or substance. The people who had knelt in prayer before the image now looked at it with a sense of profound violation and mounting fury. They saw the brushstrokes where they had once seen solid metal, and they realized that their devotion had been directed at a decorative trick. The man who had spent his life killing for money had managed to force his victims to worship a lie, ensuring that his fame would be maintained at the lowest possible cost to his own estate. Every time a citizen looked at the wall, they were reminded not of their own glory, but of the fact that they had been cheated by a master of deception. The bitter irony of the situation was that the fresco was so well executed that it could not simply be removed without acknowledging the city's own foolishness and the depth of the commander's betrayal. They were forced to keep the lie on the wall, a permanent scar of their own making that would watch over them for generations. The Silver Knight remained in his painted saddle, looking down with a detached and superior gaze at the people he had exploited in life and mocked in death. He had achieved the ultimate mercenary goal of being rewarded for a victory he never truly intended to share with those who paid for it. Fate had proved to be a cruel and indifferent judge, allowing a man who had waded through the blood of 5,000 innocents in Cesena to die in the lap of luxury and be buried with the honors of a king. There was no divine retribution, no sudden fall from grace, and no moment of final justice for the thousands of lives he had ruined. He had successfully navigated the moral vacuum of his age, proving that a total lack of conscience combined with a sharp analytical mind could indeed lead to a life of absolute triumph and a death surrounded by the highest accolades of civilization. The final image of the story is one of profound and unsettling injustice that lingers in the mind like a cold fog. While the true story of the commander's atrocities was being buried under the weight of his gold and the passage of years, his painted image continued to command respect in the holy halls of the church. The victims of his white company had been forgotten by the history books, their screams silenced by the clinking of coins and the grand orations of bishops. The butcher had won, not just on the field of battle, but in the very memory of the world, leaving a legacy of blood that had been successfully laundered into a narrative of noble service. As the years turned into centuries, the name of John Hawkwood became a standard entry in the lists of great military leaders, his crimes reduced to footnotes or ignored altogether by those who admired his tactical genius. The Silver Knight had successfully rewritten his own ending, ensuring that the world would remember the polish of his armor rather than the darkness of his deeds. He remained a haunting reminder that in the theater of power, the curtain often closes on the villain who has managed to steal the scenery, the props, and the box office receipts, leaving the audience to applaud an empty stage in a state of bewildered, helpless rage. The story ends not with peace, but with a cold realization of how easily the truth can be consumed by the needs of the powerful. Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, had been turned into a monument to its own deception, forced to guard the memory of a man who had never been more than a predator in their midst. The memory of the real Hawkwood, the men who counted severed ears and ordered the slaughter of sleeping cities, was replaced by the shimmering, painted knight on the cathedral wall, a phantom of glory that would continue to lie to the world as long as the paint remained on the stone, a final, enduring act of betrayal against history itself.